Hello there. My name is Anthony Brown. I work at Clermont. Perhaps you'll know that by now, but I'm delighted to bring to you another episode of our Privacy in the New World series. It's our Privacy and Data Talks series. I'm delighted today to be joined by Bill Karazsia of Fortive. As you'll know by now as well, hopefully if you've seen any of the other podcasts, our aim really is to bring you thoughts, insight, opinion, and maybe a few interesting stories along the way from some of the world's leading privacy and data thought leaders. Bill, it's great to have you on the show on this sunny Friday morning. How are you?
I'm just great. Thanks, Anthony. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. This is my second ever podcast, and certainly my first one that involves video. So thanks for the good reason to shower and get properly dressed this morning.
No problem. No, it's great to have you on, Bill. I must say as well, I mean, your setup in the background is one that I'd perhaps aspire to have, with the bat phone, the red bat phone, and the very professional microphone in the front as well. So it's great to have you on. Obviously, we've known each other for a few years now, Bill. I've known you since you first pretty much arrived in the UK from the US, and you've had a really interesting few years, both in the US and in the UK. I think notably you were at Virgin Media in senior privacy role there, and subsequently you've moved on to Fortive, who are a Fortune 500 industrial technology conglomerate company, where you're the Assistant General Counsel for privacy and data protection. Just for anyone who's listening, Bill, that's not familiar with Fortive, could you just tell us a little bit about it briefly, please?
Sure, of course. Fortive, you've really, you started out bang on. Fortive is an industrial technology conglomerate. We're a parent company of about 25 opcos operating worldwide in about 62 jurisdictions, about 30,000 employees. And our business or our operating companies fall largely into three main segments: industrial technologies, field solutions, and healthcare.
Wow. So as we know, obviously, well, for obvious reasons, healthcare has been, right in the epicenter of the global efforts with the COVID-19 pandemic over the last few months. I say it every time, and people who have listened to any of these podcasts so far will know that I don't want to dwell at all on the last few months. It's about looking forward and being positive. But I guess for you, Bill, and in the context of the sort of sector that you work in, it must have been an incredibly busy time for you over the last few months.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I have worked longer and probably harder in the last 4 months than I ever have in the entire course of my career. And I say that as somebody that spent about 4 years in big law. So I think as a point of reference, that probably speaks volumes. And certainly the healthcare space has been an important one for us to continue to follow. But I can say, perhaps representative of a lot of my colleagues and peers throughout the industry, that in a way that I think employees and employee data has not always been the forefront of a privacy professional's concern, because customer data or third-party data has always, as an objective matter, received the spotlight. But in a way like never before, employee data, health and safety, performance of health and safety requirements, and getting it right for employees has been a focus like I have never seen before. And it's been really satisfying, and also been an opportunity really to get to know and work under the gun with colleagues that I otherwise wouldn't have been at a table with, or virtual table with. So it's been very busy time, but also a time that I'm very grateful to have had so much work to do, because it certainly took your mind off of not being able to resume the lives that we were used to living just 4 months ago.
Yeah, indeed. And what would you say, Bill, has been the biggest privacy challenge, in general, and you can be as explicit as you want about your own work, or as a broader spectrum for privacy pros. I mean, is it something that leaps out at you?
There's one thing that I think easily leaps out as the biggest challenge in the era of COVID, and in a really heavily diversified organization like mine, keeping tabs on exactly what a privacy regulator was saying about what could and could not be asked of employees or visitors to a facility at any given time has been something that we wanted to get out ahead of and stay very informed and very current about. And we've done that, but it has been a huge challenge in finding the right resourcing and talent to get us the information we need, in tracking that talent or that information, and then getting it to the right outlets within the company. To just give a perspective in quantitative terms, in my experience just in these last 4 months, the regulatory market, if there is such a thing, the regulatory market has really settled around about 5 questions that you can ask an individual in order to screen them for their ability perhaps to enter a facility or to attend a public event or to carry on their work, even in a social distanced way. And those 5 questions, I think a proper way to do it, and certainly one in an organization where there's a great investment in privacy and getting it right. You need to know jurisdiction by jurisdiction which of those 5 questions you're allowed to ask. And then in every jurisdiction, for every question, there's a different analysis we found in whether you can ask an employee or a visitor, so an otherwise unrelated third party. And so if you do the math in these jurisdictions that are most important and most frequently tapped for us, we've got about 35 jurisdictions, 5 questions, and 2 different audiences you can ask it to. And that for us boils down to tracking 350 data elements twice a week for updates. And that's just getting the information in. Getting it in the right hands it's been a mountain of work. That part hasn't been a challenge for us because we're set up pretty well for success there. But getting that information and keeping it current, because it changes up to twice a week, has been, I think, not just a challenge, but one that I've seen us respond very well to.
Yeah, I mean, it's an enormous challenge, and more so than ever at a time when it's been more difficult in many ways to work in close quarters with your colleagues. It's an enormous task, isn't it, to pull all that together? I mean, more so than ever, everyone's had to contribute and collaborate, to pull all this together in super quick time as well. This is pushing the boundaries. This is new work. So it's amazing. And my hat's off to you, Bill, and your peers and all the right organisations who have had to really pivot very quickly and adapt to the new world.
Actually, I'm going to, for the sake of keeping this banterish, right, I want to go back to something we mentioned earlier. Can you really see the bat phone? I
can see the bat phone. It's fantastic.
It is actually a bat phone.
Is it really?
Yeah, I wanted one for ages, and I wanted one really because there's no dial on it. It's only a ring phone.
Right.
And I really, for as long as I can remember, I've never liked being on the phone. And I find it an absolute opportunity for me to be distracted in the world. Just about 4 or 5 months ago, when calls were simply calls, voice calls, I noticed myself having a real problem even then, zoning out. So during lockdown, and I spent most of lockdown in the States actually, a lot of America went on sale, including the suppliers of bat phones. So I got one at a discount and brought it back. So I plugged it right in.
Well, I'm sure the question on everyone's lips is, has it rung yet, Bill?
So because this is an ancient hardwired phone and nobody has, I probably don't even have the number for my flat, the hardwired flat telephone line. The answer is no, it hasn't rung. But when it does, we all should be worried.
Please let us know, and we'll do a follow-up podcast as and when it's rung. So moving forward, Bill, as well, in the new world, as it's coined now, what do you see? Is there a specific privacy challenge on the horizon? I'm thinking here, you know, I guess for you as an international and US business, CCPA, or, you know, is it what in general is on your mind at the moment?
Right. So I have an answer that responds, I think, directly to the question, and I'll get to that. I think, but I will tell you the thing on my mind, if we can sort of continue the discussion just for a second about the data points that we're looking at twice a week. What's on my mind there is certainly not wanting to get it wrong, but why are we updating? Why are we looking at these data points so frequently? Somebody might say we should look at these data points so frequently because if suddenly a regulator changes their mind and doesn't want you to ask a visitor about their contact with third parties or close contacts who have a suspected case of COVID, then we want to switch that question off in that jurisdiction. And I think there's something to that, right? It makes sense. We don't want to ask a question we shouldn't ask. I think companies that have a process set up where they're looking for that information and getting those updates, even if they get it wrong for a few days, will probably find forgiveness from a regulator who has identified them as having done the right thing and tried their best to switch a question from on to off, right? So that's not my worry, my chief worry in maintaining these data elements. My chief worry is not turning a question from no to yes quickly enough. Because I think there you sort of get a false negative or a type 2 error that is far worse than, in my opinion, than asking a question you shouldn't ask. Because if there's an opco that can benefit from finding out about third-party contact or close household contact with a visitor that doesn't know they can ask that question and are therefore deprived of the insight from that question and being able to make a entry determination on that information, then I feel like that's where I've really fallen down. So we don't monitor that. It's not a chief worry for me because we want to find out what we can't ask. We actually want to find out what we can ask and empower our operating companies or folks who are similarly situated to me to get the information in the hands of the people to whom it matters most. So that's sort of on my day-to-day chief worry. But in keeping for the spirit, and as you introduced the podcast or the podcast, keeping with the spirit of not making this all about COVID, even in a world where that's hard to do, I think the biggest challenge for companies that play in really smart and really fast-moving data spaces is going to be, or is already, machine learning and artificial intelligence. The regulatory framework around that is, I think, unsettled. I think it's an area where, much like GDPR about 4 years ago when it was published, has a lot more opinions than actionable intelligence and actionable guidance. And it is an area that, if I can abuse an analogy, that it reminds me a lot of collateralized debt obligations and structured finance tactics from the late 2000s, where if a practitioner, if a lawyer, a finance lawyer answers honestly, will tell you that during that time there were plenty of client engagements where lawyers simply didn't know what that documentation meant, right? And artificial intelligence as an application and as a business accelerator, I think, in the hands of a lot of really smart folks in the world, is still one where if you pop up in the bonnet, you're not quite sure what you're looking at. So I think there's a lot for the industry to settle on, and perhaps some voluntary undertakings on how data can be crunched through AI. I think if we don't get that right, and we don't act in the best interest of the data subject there, then we can see a whole wave of regulations come in that we wish we could have avoided.
Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt that there's continued challenges ahead, and well, for our lifetimes, it's going to continue to grow, as we know, within the privacy arena. And certainly, I know you've been involved in the community for many years, Bill, both in the US and the UK, as I mentioned earlier. And I think during that time, and obviously I've been very much involved as well for many years now in talking to people like yourself and obviously advising and helping them with their next steps in their careers. But obviously it's evolved, it's become a sexier place to be. You know, more and more graduates, for example, are interested in a career in privacy, and quite rightly so. It's incredibly diverse and exciting career to carve out. It's becoming more and more crowded though, inevitably, as we know. And I know that through your career, you've been heavily involved in hiring in businesses that you've worked at. I think, you know, my perception is, and from where we sit, is that, you know, there are differentiators between the good and the great in privacy. And I'd really appreciate your take on that, Bill. You know, in terms of, I guess the question is, what in your view separates the good from the great in your world as a privacy pro?
I'm actually so glad to be asked that question. Thank you for bringing it up. If you, if you attend a privacy conference, or like us, if you've been sort of following the industry for, greater than a decade, you know that there's been a vast influx of folks who perhaps have repurposed their skills quite ably into the privacy space, but are fairly new arrivers. And I think actually some of that, if you look and you trace some of the careers, coincidentally, I think that is an outgrowth of the financial crisis of 08, 09. But in any case, there is no shortage of supply of candidates in the roles that I've looked to fill over the years. But there is something, as you put in very descriptive terms, that separates the good from the great. I landed on that just, I would say, well, this year, and I put a word around it, and it's not an original thought. It's certainly nothing I invented, but I think it is, one that really hits the nail on the head, and that's authenticity, right? And I don't necessarily look for somebody that has X number of years of experience doing a particular thing in privacy. I look for somebody that has an authentic command of the discipline, an authentic command of their space, right? They know their subject cold. I tell you what I'm prepared to do, actually. If it's okay with you, if you think this podcast is the right forum for it, I will share. I'm prepared to share the one question that I think begins a conversation around whether a candidate has an authentic command of the discipline.
Please, Bill.
We'll get there. I'm gonna leave everybody in a bit of bated breath. But to me, in the practical execution, right? If I hire a lawyer, an outside lawyer, to help with a project, right, or go to a firm with an engagement, my sort of run rules are, if I ever receive a reply by email that begins with the words "under the laws of England and Wales," right, or "under New York law," I already know that, number one, there'll be 7 more paragraphs that follow the first one, and it's not going to give me a practical answer. Secondly, I think if somebody begins to tell me, if a challenge is presented of any sort of variety, and the response involves something like suggesting that a DPIA is performed, or that a regulatory notification might be required, to me that's just reciting book knowledge, which isn't necessarily easy to grasp, but it's also certainly not helpful for somebody who's got their boots on the ground and trying to solve problems for the business.
Yeah.
But if we could sort of let the cat out of the bag, I will say that the question I ask in interviews now, and have done for a year or so, is I ask somebody to put themselves in a scenario where they are advising the marketing department, and the marketing department asks whether or not they can launch a particular campaign, and I ask the candidate if they wouldn't mind to just share their thinking with me around the legal basis they would use to justify the campaign if it can go forward, and to please make sure that they address both consent and legitimate interest. And you drill down, in my opinion, this question allows the candidate to show their stuff if they can drill down and articulate where many folks can't, actually, in my experience. They can articulate that indeed there is a legitimate interest in soft opt-in possibility, and in fact, probably most marketing cases fall into it, to reach out to a customer and engage in particularly electronic direct marketing or direct marketing by electronic means, using legitimate interest and not consent. So that, to me, if somebody can give a great answer to that question, then the rest of the interview is one I'm going to be very interested in hearing more about.
Very interesting, Bill. Thank you for that insight. And I can only imagine as well that, you know, in the future, when you're interviewing people, if somebody seems like they've got a ready-made answer to that, then we know they've tuned into this podcast.
That's right. I've got to come up with a new question now.
Yeah, they'll get extra points for that anyway, won't they? Yeah. They're doing their due diligence.
I have a feeling that every candidate you might send to me in the future will be very prepared for that question.
Absolutely. Yeah, noted, and I'll be drilling down on that. Just a sort of slight left field question for you, and sorry to put you on the spot with this one. If there was a privacy law, perhaps a specific privacy law, that had an element of it that you could change, what do you think that may be?
Do you know, I've sat in front of the text of a lot of different privacy laws, and certainly understand some of them a lot better than others. But I'll tell you this, I think the one thing that I can hope one day changes, or that I would like to wave a magic wand and change, because I just don't get what the law says now, is the CCPA's treatment of service providers and exempt third parties. I sat with that section and those articles in the CCPA since, gosh, it had to have been October 2018, on planes, trains, and automobiles, and I just conceptually fail to understand the material difference between those two parties, and why the contractual obligations that essentially a data controller in California needs to put in front of those two third parties. So that has been a huge challenge for me to understand, one that I have spent not only time but money trying to solve. So I think there's an opportunity for clarification there, or at least we can identify a development goal for me in 2020. And the other thing that I wish would change in the sense of being set out more clearly one way or the other, is the legitimate interest assessment conversation in the GDPR. I spent a lot of time with that article as well. To me, it's I get why a documented and demonstrable assessment needs to be made about legitimate interest, because if you look at all the other legal bases, they have, in a way, a self-executing demonstration or an artifact, right? Consent has the consent and the proof that it was obtained. Contracts themselves are living artifacts. A vital interest is something that sort of comes up quite quickly, but you can usually create organically an artifact that demonstrates how you came out there. Legitimate interest is hugely relied on legal basis, and in my reading of the GDPR, there's nothing that mandates a legitimate interest assessment be performed. That's certainly part of the broader conversation around how you justify legitimate interest. But there's not a requirement, a thou shall statement around a legitimate interest assessment. But if you go to particularly an outside law firm, they advance and promote the notion of a legitimate interest assessment as, frankly, a real thing that needs to be put together and kept. And I don't think, number one, I don't necessarily think the law is crystal clear in the mandate around a legitimate interest assessment. So if there's scope for clarification one way or the other, I think that's great. And I also think it is, it's certainly something that we do, and it's certainly something that lands on me as a burden for the business. So if this is not what is actually required by the law, and it's more of a nice to have than a must have, then that would allow us to adjust our processes and procedure and our privacy compliance accordingly. So those are my two.
Very interesting, Bill. Thank you. And I'm sure both of those points that you elaborated on, any of your contemporaries and peers will find that very, very interesting. And I'm sure many of them will share your thoughts on that as well.
Do you know, I'm actually more, as you get this session posted, Anthony, I would actually love to hear more from people who would disagree. And I think these environments are great to sort of advance a point and begin a discussion. But if I'm on a panel or if I'm in an audience, I get much more, of a stimulating experience if people actually disagree. So I would love to know folks, or know the thoughts of folks who are listening to this and say, oh, he's wrong, right? And here are good reasons why. You
never know, that backphone might be ringing off the hook when this goes live.
I won't call them, I promise.
Yeah. So, and just to sort of wrap things up, Bill, I always typically end with a question asking people what they've learned about themselves over the last few weeks, often confined to their homes. If I may say, because prior to lockdown, we've seen each other and we know each other. If you don't mind me saying something I've learned about you during lockdown is that you've grown an incredible beard. It's a thing of beauty. Hopefully I've not taken your answer to that out of your mouth, but is there anything you've learned over the last few weeks specifically?
So about myself, yeah, I mean, the reactions, the spontaneous reactions I get when I'm on camera with somebody for the first time in a long time are really entertaining about my beard. And what I learned about my beard is that at a certain stage, quite early on in the growing experience, it stops being a beard and truly becomes whiskers. I mean, it grows out more than it grows down. And this was more of a commitment and a bit of fun I was having with my barber. And now that the UK is reopening salons, I'll get to visit him on Monday. So watch the space.
Yeah. Before you carry on, what's your plan moving forward? Is the beard going to be trimmed, or is this a line thing?
It's going to be trimmed and maintained in a controlled way.
Yeah.
We're sort of going back to pre-pandemic beard status.
Yeah, fantastic.
I was born for quarantine. I mean, I have soaked in every minute of it. I got to spend 4 months together with my parents, which wasn't always easy for them. And every once in a while wasn't easy for me, but it was an opportunity I absolutely never would have taken and never would have thought to have if it weren't for lockdown. And I just returned to the UK 2 weeks ago to my flat and beginning to do some DIY stuff and decluttering. And I was subject to the self isolation order, and I honestly didn't miss a beat. And I think that I will take some learnings from that forward when, in my favorite phrase to use these days, when all this is over. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, that's all on our sort of tip of our tongue, isn't it? Hopefully, when it's all over, that's for sure. But Bill, unfortunately, on that note, this podcast is all over. But I just want to thank you so much. It's been a fantastic chat with you. You're always so engaging, and you clearly know your stuff. Forwards, backwards, each way around. And I hope our listeners have really taken something away for this. So as is protocol, in a minute, I'm going to do the sort of shuffle with the mouse to close off this video. And we're going to do the wave. But Bill, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking. Have a great weekend. And we will, of course, catch up again very soon. And thanks for listening, everybody. Another podcast will be coming up very shortly. Cheers now. Thanks, Bill.